Welcome to the Redacted Culture Cast for episode 63, titled Intel as Entertainment, News as Information. If you're watching on the screen, if you're watching on YouTube, you will notice, or if you've been to the website lately, you'll notice that the background is starting to change. The official announcement, if this is your first time hearing it, is that on 3/30, the official Into Beasts line will drop. That will be for Season 1, Operation 2, in conjunction with Ethan Walters, also known as Gypsy Walters. Thank you very much. So moving on directly into the meat. The field of epistemology, when surveyed by, or when in comparison to the other sections of philosophical study, like like ethics and metaphysics, oftentimes comes across as the third wheel of the engagement. Epistemology can oftentimes be misconstrued with a let's just say it, an asshole student in a classroom trying to ask a question to stump the professor, not to learn anything. And that is not how, and the field itself, because it deals with knowledge, can very quickly become the breeding ground for intellectually dishonest conversations. However, when it comes to the world that we live in, the field of epistemology, or the even basic establishment and understanding of concepts of epistemology, allow us to, or give us some tools by which to parse out the information that we are engaged in. The world that we live in 2023 might correctly be described as the post-information age. The information age, which some of us were born into and many of us grew up in, and some of us came into this world afterwards, could be described as the time in the Western development, or the Western course of history, where information suddenly became rapidly available to the entire population through methods of delivery like cable news network, the radio, and the internet. But the post-information age, much like the postmodern description, is trying to describe something that I think we live in now, where it is no longer the access to information which is a bottleneck, as Vlad was saying on a live stream we did on Instagram recently, but it's no longer the access to information that is the problem. Rather, it is the ability to evaluate information. In other words, we are no longer being restricted from reading the books, the articles, the documents, the otherwise sealed statements. It's not that we don't have access to them. It is more likely the fact that we have to be more correct, or more accurate, or more rigorous in the methods of evaluating said information. The term heuristic will come up occasionally, and a heuristic sits somewhere between it's not an assumption, but it's a heuristic is a method or a tool used for coming to a conclusion with a decent amount of reliability. It struggles in the world of philosophy because it doesn't function as a proof. It could be sometimes described as a reasonable guess, or a sort of habitual method of evaluating certain types of information that involves an assumed risk. But more on that later. Even if not in this show, we will certainly be addressing the subject of heuristics for later. And the title of Intel as Entertainment, News and Information, starts from a series of observations that I've noticed about, in some part the YouTube sphere, in some part the podcasting sphere, in some part the gun culture world, in some part Americana as a whole. And a lot of it stems from really the last 10 years. Probably the last 10 years is an assessment. It's a loose range, but it's something that I've noticed more and more and more as time goes on. We'll see if this is the I bought a new car and therefore I see that new car problem, or if it is a more accurate description going forward. But there are things that we've engaged with in conversation, especially in the world of information and intel, that highlight this problem. One of them, and I've noticed this in myself even regularly, is that I will consume material on various internet distributed platforms, be it social media, YouTube, and so forth, or podcasts, or different, or even books at this point in time, that that are centered on this concept of intelligence, military intelligence. Those in the military are familiar with the term. Those in the military are most like who have been in the military are most likely familiar with the joke that military intelligence is an oxymoron. But going forward, most importantly, there is this way that we can consume intel as if it wasn't in relation to a task at hand, but rather as a form of entertainment. And I am certainly guilty of this. So, the goal of this entire show, 5 minutes and 50 seconds into it, is to identify four concepts: intel, entertainment, news, and information, and identify what is the proper place and method of approaching these four concepts. This information is this concept, this idea is sort of built on a foundation, or built within the environment of what we would refer to as fifth generational warfare. And in the world of, and as much as fifth generational warfare feels like a plane being built mid-flight, the something worth mentioning is that in what we are referring to as fifth generational warfare, a person might conclude accurately that an opponent being rendered incapable of making decisions or evaluating information would effectively be considered a casualty. If I can defeat my opponent by affecting their environment in such a way that they are incapable of making decisions or proper evaluations of information, effectively blinding them, then I could say that they're defeated. Or it's a way of taking otherwise effective combatants out of the fight. And one thing that fifth generational warfare is regularly accused of being is an information war. It's not about what is true, it is about what people believe, or how they come to belief, if you want to get even one layer deeper. This being the case, it leaves us rife. Even by describing something like fifth generational warfare in this concept, it leaves the environment, the battlefield of sorts, rife with landmines of plausibility. In other words, everything and nothing at the same time is suddenly an example of fifth generational warfare. There is no such thing as coincidence. I must find the hidden meaning. This obsession with intel as a form of entertainment can very quickly debilitate an individual if they are incapable or rendered incapable of evaluating information properly. Some of this, though, happens on the individual level. We do this to ourselves. We do this to ourselves when we give sources of information, whether it is the cable news or a podcaster like myself, or a newspaper or a website of that type, undue influence over our decision making processes. An example of this, drawn from history pretty frequently, is that when the radio show of War of the Worlds came out, it was so convincing that some people thought it was real. And it's not to attack the intelligence of said people, but it's to identify what happens when you when you put a source of information in the wrong place. Gun culture itself has already a similarity of this baked into its cake. We find it distasteful, if not worse than merely childish, when entertainment is used to drive action. When, because I saw it in a video game, is a claim made for justifying a certain action, as in like a tactic. When I saw it in Call of Duty, is used unironically as an argument for whether or not a maneuver should be accomplished a certain way, or so long and so forth. The issue isn't that the person might be using a description, because I certainly have used examples like video games to convey a concept. It's when the video game, the form of entertainment, is seen as or used as an authority to make an argument for a claim. So let's go back to the beginning. Intel as entertainment. There is also a value set that is part of Western culture that is a sort of vestige of the Enlightenment era, which suggests that we like to think of ourselves as knowing what we're talking about. A person who is in the know is someone both to be desired and whose opinion would be considered valuable about a subject. Another example of this would be the experts. Trusting an expert would be somebody who, or should be somebody, whose opinion is that which we can trust in regards to a given subject. But what we are discovering in our day and age is not only that some of the experts might actually not be worthy of listening to, we are also recognizing, and perhaps as an example of this, that sometimes we ourselves, myself included, will pursue information that appears has the aesthetic of military intelligence regarding potential threats in my area, not for the intent of evaluating the risk assess or making a risk assessment or area study of my environment, but rather to give myself the feeling that I know what's going on, a sense in anything, an emotional sense of control, whether or not it is reflected in real life. And so, intel, when it comes to gun culture, maybe it's, do I know about a new thing coming out, or what a person's background is or isn't, or who said what about who, or what laws are coming into pass, or who is going to make what moves against it, or all of these, which military organization is going to buy which gear. All of this kind of information, this intel kind of material, is it kind of floats out in the world of information, and we're not forced to, but we have the opportunity to evaluate it, and we have to ask ourselves how we evaluate it. Now, the word epistemology is referred to as the philosophy of knowledge, as in what is knowledge, what is in like an inference. How do we come to a conclusion? Not necessarily how we come to a conclusion about something, but it is what types of knowledge are there: experiential, memorable, or memorial. There might also be a priori knowledge or a posteriori knowledge, and I'm going to pronounce a posteriori wrong because that's just kind of how it happens. But so the point in all of the address of introducing epistemology as a study, or in epistemology as a material, to a podcast that oftentimes is more about guns and gun culture, is to focus on how we think of information, how we think of the information that we consume, how we think of the information that we seek out. So, to begin, criticism. We know what happens when people misconstrue entertainment as as a good argument. We also can see it when you may have sort of an intel version of clout chasing. He doesn't know what he's talking about. As equivalent to he doesn't know how to shoot. We might see this example of intel, the pursuit of intel being misguided. It's not that information isn't beneficial for you. It's that don't confuse the possession of information with the ability to evaluate it. The second side of this one is news as information. Now, this criticism is easier to make because we already make it pretty regularly. We already have a certain amount of skepticism that whatever it is that we call the news is really giving us an honest take, per se. It is actually presenting the information honestly. There's this value that we state that news is supposed to be. Whatever happened to the news just telling you the news, not their own opinions or whatever? When did the New York Times start confusing factual reporting with opinion pieces, or the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal? When did this line between opinion and fact get confused? When did the line between evaluation and information get confused? This is the point. I think that we have to come to we have to come to terms with the conclusion that It is possible for a news source, an individual, to present information absent bias or whatever you want to call it. It is impossible for a person or speaker, even in this case myself, to present information without it being presented within the context of their own knowledge. And as a result, it is just as much as it is the responsibility of the speaker to present that information as cleanly and as accurately as possible. It is the responsibility of the student or the listener to attempt to find the information there and the method of evaluation and make decisions upon it. And this can come across as a little well, maybe not, maybe it's not comforting immediately. This may come across as a little bit like, well, we just have to get smarter. There is no easy way out. And well, when it comes to philosophy, sometimes that's the answer, is that there is no easy, quick solution. There is no short, quick pass go collect your $200. Sometimes the work is required. But when we come back to this argument, I want to focus, when we come back to these four concepts: intel, entertainment, news, and information. I want to describe it in the lens of both fifth generational warfare as a concept and as individuals existing within culture, so to speak. And let's start with fifth generational warfare. If it is the case that we are in a conflict, and it's reasonable to assume so, or it's reasonable to come to this conclusion so, if we are to begin from the assumption, this is not a negative statement, but assumption is a condition to the conversation, that we are engaged in some form of fifth generational warfare against a conscious adversary, it would be reasonable to assume, or it would be reasonable to conclude, that that adversary would gain if us, our people, our whatever they are in opposition to, are incapable of evaluating information properly. Whether that comes from the education system, the information that they consume, social media, the news, Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones, or anyone who's talking, the Russian disinformation bots, the whatever you want to call it. The ability, if I could find a way to make my opponent unable to determine fact from fiction, I would gain an advantage over them, because they would be simultaneously paralyzed by paranoia and incapable of acting when action really is needed. So when I look at that on ourselves, if I think, are there adversaries who may be quote unquote waging fifth generational warfare on us, I think that there are some rather clear examples of how that could be the case. And one of them would be the use of organizations or structures like something like Antifa. Is that what it does is it's a form, like a tool like gaslighting. I know it sounds political, but an organization that functions like an Antifa style cell, which is simultaneously present, acting in front of you, but also not real. They're not an organization. They're just, sporadic actors motivated by some sense of goodwill for who knows what, right? And so if I were to be, if I that is one example of applying, an epistemological weapon to a population, rendering them incapable of or ineffective at addressing a problem because of it shrouding itself in definitional problem, or refusing definition of sorts. But another example, which might be a little bit more closer to home, would be the idea of the conspiracy theory. And that would be, a conspiracy theory is an epistemological problem as well as a metaphysics problem, but it's primarily a metaphysics problem shrouded in an epistemological issue. And the result is a incorrect, or a perception of the world that is counter to reality by breaking the epistemological ability to the epistemology of the individual. A conspiracy theorist would be somebody who gives weight or authority or action or makes beliefs about the world in this way that are counter to reality and according to a certain method of thinking that gets them there. Let me explain. We've talked about conspiracy theories before and why I think the danger of conspiracy theories in forms of fifth generational warfare is that if they can be spread enough, they can render a population incapable of observing what is actually going on. Now, it would require us to explain what a conspiracy theory is, but then the good answer, and if we want to skip ahead a little bit to the good part, is that there is a conclusion. I think there's a solution to it, and the irony, not the irony, the similarity that the idea of a conspiracy theory would apply to fifth generational warfare is that one of the challenges that this way of thinking produces is it both affirms its existence and denies it at the same time. So, one of the challenges that's presented in the idea of fifth generational warfare, in fact, one of the problems that I have with the use of the term entirely is that it is not, it is either baked into the system of what we consider fifth generational warfare to be a sort of denial of what it is, a challenge to its own existence. In other words, meme man holding a butterfly. Is this fifth, literally anything? Is this fifth generational warfare? Um, that might be part of it. It's and the problem that it is that it might the problem of it being that it might be part of it does illuminate sort of the problem. So so going back to this idea of what would be an appropriately what I think is the correct explanation and definition of what a conspiracy theory is in the shortest of terms is a method of evaluating information in order to fit it into a preconceived network, a preconceived framework, which on a metaphysics level applies intention to people with insufficient validation or insufficient verification. Probably the best way I can say it is that we know there's this thing called a theory. A theory is a hypothesis in some sense, but we know that there is this thing called a theory, and we know that there is this thing called a conspiracy. People can conspire. I can have a theory. There is a theory of relativity. There is a theory of whatever, quantum theoretics. These two terms, theory and conspiracy, do both hold weight in our world. But when we combine them together and we talk about the idea of a conspiracy theory, what we're doing is we are applying a moral pejorative to a possible truth that is implying a conspiratorial intent. Now that I recognize that it's somewhat of a technical way of saying it, but the challenge then that the real casualty that comes out of what you would call a conspiracy theory is that the individual becomes incapable of evaluating information, and this must be separated from the sort of accusational use of wielding the term conspiracy theory. I know that there is a history of the term. Maybe the term was sort of produced by a certain government agency to cast doubt on the aspersions or accusations of detractors. I know that news organizations and public individuals use the term conspiracy theory to cast doubt on an explanation of something, but neither of those are really relevant to us at all. First of all, well, neither of those are all that relevant to us at all. Mostly because both of them are attempts to use a moral implication baked into a concept to accuse somebody of being a thing. You don't accuse somebody of being a conspiracy theorist. That is not a proper use of grammar, and that is not a proper use of the term. Believing in a conspiracy theory, or maybe being disabled by the weapon being conspiracy theory, might be a better way of thinking about it. That it's not so much that maybe even others of a casualty of conspiracy theory. Casualty meaning, and what I mean by casualty is that it doesn't actually require that anybody produce the theory and cast it on you. Conspiracy theories are not magic spells to be cast on people, but they are convincing narratives that give moral implication to the actions of maybe individuals, targets, or people they don't like, which then implies that there's justification for use of force or isolation or public humiliation of those people. Ergo, problem with the news. And so, what this applies to when we're talking about intel, and intel as entertainment and news as information, is that when if we're going to drive down what I believe to be the correct application and use of these terms, and what that looks like going forward, is that intel, when we're looking for intel, what we need to first recognize is it's not intelligence if it is not information that um, it is not information that contributes to an end goal. Intel, military intel, and one of the challenges that the military might deal with when it comes to intel, especially and even worse, civilians, citizens, citizens concerning risk, people who are prepared citizens, whatever you want to call it, and this side of gun culture is that not even this side of gun culture. This part that gun culture as a whole must recognize is that intel must exist within a framework of having an objective. If it is not in reference to an objective, if it is not in reference to something, it's not intel, it's information. It's purely just information. By calling it intel or by pursuing intel as a form of entertainment, right? It's nice to feel like you're in the know, but what for? Good question to ask, myself included. Is that if we are spending our time entertaining ourselves with intel, not saying it's good to consume, but if we are entertaining ourselves with a form of information without being able to articulate in which direction it is being used or what's the purpose of it. For example, I might look at a intel spreadsheet considering and what would refer to as an intel, a piece of intel or information regarding the threat matrix of the environment I live in, according to extremist groups. That information needs to be basically, it needs to be put into context of what is my objective. Why am I even seeking out this information? It's not that it should be barred from me, whether or not I have justification, but no, rather it is a personal responsibility. It's something that you must do yourself to ask yourself, why am I pursuing this information? To what end? What am I getting out of it? Where am I going with it? Because I too have been found myself going down the rabbit hole of just trying to find out more about something, whether it is a domestic terrorist organization, whether it's about a current series of events, ergo Waco, whether it's about who's doing what where. The sense of urgency provided by acquiring a certain piece of information that might be pertinent to myself can become masturbatory, especially when it leads to no follow-up or no reasonable maybe no intent to follow up. Maybe the answer is I might consume a piece of information and say this information is not useful to me, and then I'll catalog it and throw it away or put it away. But do not confuse the acquisition of information. Do not allow the acquisition of information to become masturbatory. I know it's a dirty word, but we got to go that direction. The second one is news is information. I think we can come to the conclusion that news, like the news that we listen to, we like to think that the people that we listen to are providing information that's relevant to us today. And from time to time, this requires a constant reevaluation, and that's how it's kind of a gut check in a way. News, when I think of when I listen to these, when I made this observation, the statement, this thing coming back to intel as entertainment, news as information. I think what we're recognizing is different types of information are being used incorrectly. Regardless of whether the news calls itself the news is primarily entertainment, especially when it has no direct correlation to my own life. If I watch the news every night, or if I watch, it doesn't matter who I'm watching in the social media sphere, whether it's Tim Pool, Jack Posobiec, Maj Touré, so on and so forth, it it does me no good if I'm simply watching it for entertainment's sake. It doesn't mean that it can't be entertaining, but it means that I should not fool myself into thinking that I'm watching it when I'm watching something for entertainment's sake. I'm actually watching it for information's sake. And this is a personal check. Back to epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge which exists on a foundation of metaphysics and functions in tandem with something like ethics. How do we know? What should we know? And epistemology is also the foundation of science. So yeah, so this is, I mean, I'm going to make that. I don't mean this to be too chat of a move if that sounds a little too short-sighted, but science without epistemology is nothing but hopes and dreams. It's just wishing on an idea. And so the very concept of being able to observe something is an epistemological claim, which is which is a philosophical argument. And so now we're getting into, hopefully no more semantics on the subject. Rant over. But this also, but this, so this boils down to a consideration of the information that we consume and to what place it goes. We know that there are certain easy examples. When I play a video game, the information that I acquire from that video game goes into entertainment. Entertainment, the word, the foundation of the word entertainment is sort of grounded in this idea of absent thought, but fine, we'll let that go. So video games go into entertainment. Research goes into information. Intel goes into category operational information. So information in regards to a direction. So I might do research. I might have entertainment. I might have intelligence in reference to operation. And then there's the news. And the question is, what do we do with the news? Trust me when I say this. I know that I've heard it that the news is lying to you. I get it. The issue that the issue that's being confronted with this kind of sentiment is that it is acknowledging that one form of information is not what it's promising to be, is not the same thing as acquiring the method acquiring a method of evaluating information which is sufficient for determining what is. Just because I can tell you that that is a lie doesn't mean that I get to tell you that this is honest. Just because that I can tell you that this person is dishonest does not mean that I'm able to determine that this is factually correct. This comes down to the evaluation of information. And to return to fifth generational warfare, if the fifth generation of warfare is truly a war of the combination of ideologies and information, then one of the tools of our day and age, one of the decentralizations of conflict, as the as the world has transitioned from the very overt conventional war of World War II to the very insurgency focused conflicts of the Cold War into the contemporary era. And you could argue that the Cold War never ended, or will never end, or can never end. The that one of the most vital tools of our day and age is the ability to evaluate information. And that is a goal worth striving for. Just like we say, it is not good enough to own a rifle, you must be proficient using it. So we should say it is not good enough to obtain intel or have information, but to be able to evaluate it. Just because I can cite a document doesn't mean that just because I can cite a document doesn't mean that I am making a good argument. This applies to college students and and basically everyone else as well. Just because I have a source, just because I have information, does not make a good argument. Just because I can cite an argument doesn't make it a good argument. Further, that does not mean that infinite skepticism is also acceptable. So, in conclusion, intel as entertainment, news as information in the field of fifth generational warfare do not become a casualty, not of misinformation, but of being rendered incapable of evaluating information. Do not, in other words, in the words of Robert Rogers, Keep your powder dry, your hatchet sharp, and for my edition, make sure your mind is sharp as well. So, and not an open mind, but a clear thought, being able to evaluate information. There you go. Well, this has been Intel is Entertainment, News is Information. This has also been the 63rd episode of the Redacted Culture Cast. I hope that this has given you material to consider when looking at the world that we live in, if we truly do exist in a world of fifth generation warfare. Prepare yourself. It's going to get messy.